Since taking my art full-time, I've noticed some changes in my creativity over the past couple of years. I've noticed a resistance to creating that wasn't really there before. I've noticed that simply sitting down to play in my sketchbook is a battle with myself over whether or not I have the time, or the energy, or if I even want to in the first place. Art used to be this sanctuary for me. It was a way to wind down after a long day, a place to explore imaginary worlds and creatures, a hobby I could still participate in even when chronic illness was kicking my butt, which it often did. But when I made the decision to turn my art into a career, something shifted. In fact, I think something kind of broke. Slowly but surely, art became less of a sanctuary and more of a source of stress. During almost every creative session, there was this high pressure to perform. The pressure of making something worthy of an Instagram photo. The pressure of a camera sitting above my head recording every single mark I was making. The pressure of turning something I loved into a source of income. So art became my job rather than my passion. And truth be told, I didn't really think I loved it anymore. And if I'm being fully honest, I was so unhappy with myself and how I'd grown to view my creativity that I wasn't really sure that I was ever going to love making art again. I believed that there would now always be this unwelcome performance pressure and that art would never be a fully joyful place for me again. And what was especially frustrating was that I saw so many other artists that had turned their art into their career and were still so passionate about it. And that made me wonder, can that be true for me too? Can I learn to love my creativity again and continue to pursue it as my career? Or did I have to decide between the two? At the end of last year, I was really tired of how I felt about my creativity, and I noticed there were a lot of other artists that were fed up with their creative practices too. So I wrote a workbook to help artists nurture their creative practice. To fall in love with their art again, to heal from burnout, to develop their skills, to build up their discipline. Whatever intention they had, this workbook was designed to help them achieve it. So at the beginning of this year, I went through the workbook myself. I set the intention to fill 5 pages in my messy sketchbook each week for the month of January to nurture my love for creativity and a willingness to show up to it consistently. And I did. A little bit of that original childlike passion for art was sparked again. I was getting more excited about art, and I was spending a lot more time in my sketchbook. But I'm gonna be honest, I didn't really take the journal pages in the workbook super seriously.
I know, it's literally my own workbook. Why wasn't I putting in my full effort?
I don't know, I was lazy and apparently not fully committed. So for a while, my creative practice was more consistent and I was having a lot more fun with my art again. But life happens and I let other things start to take priority. Sometimes those were legitimate things that did need to be top priorities, and other times it was just kind of filler that was more convenient and more instantly gratifying than creating was. I let old habits of doom scrolling or mindlessly watching TV just slip back in. So that first month of nurturing was like digging a garden. I was pulling out the weeds, carefully planting the seeds, and watering them. But over time, I let the weeds grow again and take over what I'd so carefully nurtured. So fast forward to June. Over the months, my carefully tended garden became a weed-ridden land of chaos. Sketchbook sessions were few and far between. I had a mountain of art supplies that I hadn't touched in who knows how long, and my creativity felt stale. It felt stagnant. I'd crank out a piece every now and then to give me some footage for a YouTube video, but I wasn't really happy with my creativity. And that was incredibly frustrating. So in July, I decided to give the workbook another go, to set a new intention, to actually do the journal pages and work through my thoughts and emotions toward my art. I realized that my relationship with my creativity is like any other relationship in life. It takes effort. It takes sacrifice. It means showing up when it's really uncomfortable and working through the hard things and remembering that it isn't always going to feel good. So basically, I started from ground zero again, carefully digging the garden and pulling up the weeds, getting very messy and very uncomfortable. So I had a bunch of old scraps of watercolor paper and sketchbook paper and Bristol board, all just sitting in the back of my portfolio folder thingy. So I set the intention to create one piece of art every day on these old scraps of paper using any medium I wanted, creating anything I wanted. The intention was to, again, nurture my love for creativity and a willingness to show up for it consistently. I had lost the love and discipline required to fully embrace my creativity, to show up to it when it's hard and when I don't feel like it. I'd also really boxed myself into this mindset that my art had to have a specific niche or a style, something everyone could see and recognize as mine. But that mindset made me feel like I wasn't allowed to explore any other mediums or subjects in my artwork. That because I'm most known for painting with gouache, I couldn't create anything using my dip pen and inks, even though I really love those tools. Or because I don't typically paint birds, that I shouldn't quote-unquote
waste my time
painting one. But for July, I wanted to give myself the space to explore. Full creative freedom. To use any medium, to paint or draw or sketch anything, to spend 10 minutes on a piece or 4 hours on it. All I had to do was make something. So I started the intention off with the little ink and watercolor fox illustration. I'd really been missing my dip pen, and I was ready to dust it off. I played around with different swoopy shapes in the fur, used a complementary color palette that I really love, and of course, some of those little dotty spotty bits, because they make me happy. I simply showed up and made something because I wanted to. No grand end goal in mind. I didn't even have to show it to anybody if I didn't want to. And you know what? I had the most fun I'd had in a long time. I even liked the little mini swatch and mark cards. I feel like they became like their own little art pieces. So as I journaled that day, 4 very important words showed up. Excitement, passion, joy, and alive. Even though I had developed this almost bitterness toward my creativity, I realized something. The creativity wasn't dead. It just needed to be woken up again. The passion for it needed to be woken up. And with this first piece, it started to. I felt more creatively alive than I had in I don't know how long. So with such a successful first day, I was really excited for the next one. So on day 2, I realized I hadn't painted bubbles in a while, and I also hadn't gotten out my gouache in a while. I'd been pretty sick for most of May and June, and I just hadn't really had the energy for getting out my gouache, so I decided to get gouache and paint one of my very favorite Marikey Meadow characters. It had also been a while since I'd done a food painting, so I painted a little cookie as well. Painting bubbles always puts me in this really good headspace. I think because he's part of the Marikey Meadow, painting or sketching him is always a really good reminder of the joy that should be behind my creativity. A reminder that the result isn't the reward, the act of creating is. That if I'm not creating from a place of love and genuine joy, then really, what's the point? The first week was a little funky as far as the journaling went. I didn't end up journaling every day, partially because we were visiting family over the weekend, so I didn't have access to the pages on my computer. But honestly, I also just missed a couple days in there too, simply because I didn't make it a priority. I didn't fully invest myself till a little bit later on, and I'm not gonna lie, I'm pretty disappointed with myself about that. I really wish I had those pages to look back on now and know how I felt about what I'd created on each of those first days. Hindsight's 2020. So for the third day, I needed something a little bit more low-key, so I decided to do a simple sketch of the little bandana girl squatting on the ground to hold a butterfly. She's another one of my go-to characters for sketching when I don't already have an idea in mind. She's another character that I just find very grounding to paint or to draw. She reminds me of the things in life that are important to me. The importance of spending time in nature, of taking care of things, of loving the in-between mundane moments. So like I said, the first week was a little bit weird since we were out of town for the weekend, but I did bring along my art supplies to be able to keep up with my intention. I got out my multi-liners and my Copic markers after a very long hiatus from both of them. So with the multi-liner pen drawings, I began to develop a much deeper love for sketching with pens. but we'll dive into that more in one of the next videos. So even though I don't have pages for every day I created something during that first week, I did complete the set of weekly review journal pages for the first week. The overwhelming vibe throughout those pages was passion. That first week was so creatively fulfilling because I released myself from all of the creative boundaries and let go of the negative mindsets that I'd had previously. I looked at creativity as if it was a stranger that I wanted to get to know as a friend, starting from ground zero. I simply let myself create and have fun. I used mediums I'd forgotten I enjoyed, sketched whatever came to mind, and met my intention each day. So one of the questions in the weekly review pages is, how has your creative practice improved this week? And my answer for the first week was this: I feel looser when I create and much more full of ideas. I don't feel so bogged down by outside influences, and I've just been making what I want to make. So during this time, I was also taking a break from Instagram. Partially because I noticed it was a really big time sink for me, partially because I was so overwhelmed by everyone else's ideas, and partially because it just didn't really seem like it was beneficial for my business at all. So once I deleted the app, I was no longer bombarded by everyone else's styles and ideas. I could just sit and explore my own. Not to mention, I also had a lot more free time for creativity. Now you might be thinking,
wow, Allie, that all sounds really great. Your relationship with creativity was totally healed in the first week, and art hasn't been a struggle at all since, right?
Wrong. Please do not let me paint this experience as something it's not. This was just week 1. Truthfully, I was riding a bit of an emotional high that first week. I was so excited to be excited about art again, and showing up each day to create was fairly easy. I was very motivated. I liked everything I made that week, and the process for each piece was relatively stress-free. But what about the days when you don't feel like showing up? The days where something comes up and you have to pivot? The days when the creative process is incredibly frustrating or you don't like what you made? Because inevitably, those things happen. Life isn't perfect, and we're gonna face a lot of imperfection and frustration in our creative practice. Although this first week was riding the roller coaster to like that peak of passion and
sheer awesomeness,
there were a lot of shooting down into the valley of sadness and frustration moments ahead. I faced every emotion during the month of this intention. I experienced all the peaks and valleys and the feelings that come with them. So in week 1, we started at ground zero. The idea was to simply spark some joy in my creative practice again. To grab some random supplies and a scrap of paper and just make something. I was really excited, very motivated, and I was really starting to have some fun with my art again. I'd started weeding the garden of my creative practice and planting some new seeds. But although I'd weeded out some of the negative mindsets I had toward my creativity, there was still a lot of really hard work to do. A lot of deep-rooted weeds, if you will. I still had a lot of very limiting beliefs. Limiting belief number 1, I shouldn't explore different subjects in my art. If you've been around my channel for any length of time, you've probably seen me create a lot of different things. I love exploring my Meraki Meadow characters and environments. I love painting food. I love sculpting. I've painted gnomes and potted plants and yogis and dragons and frickin' soup. I'll be honest, I'm a very big nerd and I enjoy learning about things and then exploring them in my artwork. But over the past few years of taking my art full time, I've tried to force myself into a niche. One of the major pieces of advice most often given to artists taking their careers full-time is
stick to a style
or
find your niche.
And I think that is a very vague and very harmful thing to tell a creative person, especially for the ones like me who just love to explore. Now, not every artist is like that. Some artists find joy in only painting or drawing flowers or people or pet portraits, and that's absolutely okay too. But there are a lot of artists out there who find joy in the exploration of many different things, and to limit them to picking one subject or style is very creatively crippling. So in the first video, I mentioned that I started doing some more pen sketches. I've done some of these in the past, but I'd kind of let my pens collect dust for a little while. But during this month, I discovered that doing some sketches with these pens was a really great warm-up for me. It loosened up my muscles, helped me practice making marks, and just put me in a more artsy headspace. So before I would start on my daily intention piece, I guess you could call it, I would grab my pens and my little sketchbook and just do a few little doodles, sometimes from reference and sometimes from imagination. I started off with some books, just playing around with turning them in space or stacking them on top of one another. I explored different line variations and weights and marks. I was having fun with these pressure-free warm-up sketches. And then a new illustration idea came to mind. It was something that I haven't really explored before and truthfully didn't feel like I should explore now because it wasn't what I typically do. So I had the idea to illustrate like a little forest girl wearing a bird skull bending over to inspect a coyote track. Weirdly specific, I know, but I just couldn't get the idea out of my head for several days. But all of these negative and limiting thoughts started swirling around my head.
What will my audience think of this piece? It's not exactly the cozy vibes I'm known for. If I sketched it in ink, would anyone even recognize it as mine since it's not in gouache? If I made a print of it, would it even sell?
At this point, I literally hadn't even sketched it out, and I was already worried about all of the negative impact it could have on my art business. But then I thought, what's the purpose of this challenge? What is the goal of this intention? Isn't the point to create whatever I want? To nurture my creativity, not my business? And that's when the belief that I shouldn't explore a new subject just shattered. I realized that if I truly wanted to nurture my creativity, I had to let go of that belief. So I grabbed my sketchbook and pens and started practicing some bird skulls. I found some really great photos on Pinterest to learn from and started familiarizing myself with the structure. The way the top beak overlaps the bottom, the cool hole shapes of like the nasal cavity, the way the skull dips in along the eye socket and creates like these really cool curves and shadow shapes. I started to understand this new subject better, but more importantly, I started finding the beauty in it and the joy in drawing it. So on this day, I brought my idea to life. This little forager with her bird skull and her satchel. I was so genuinely excited to explore this idea and make it into an illustration that it didn't really matter to me anymore if anyone else would like it or if I'd even show it to anyone else at all. You know, the piece, it's a little weird, a little quirky, doesn't really match the art that I typically share on social media, and you know what? I couldn't care less. I felt such genuine joy for the act of creating while I was making it, and that felt really good. So on the next day, I went back to a familiar subject and familiar medium, painting bits in gouache. I had painted baubles the first week, and I wanted to have a little illustration of bits to go along with it. Y'all know, I love cozy things. I love finding the joy and coziness in the things that we don't really often appreciate, like folding laundry or doing the dishes, or in this case, grocery shopping. Illustrating quiet little moments like this helped me to see the good in my own life and really appreciate those little things. So when I had the random urge to paint a grocery bag full of carrots, I went with it. During the first week of this intention, I was very motivated, as we so often are at the beginning of a new challenge or goal we've set for ourselves. But even so, there was very much still an underlying,
I'm doing this because I have to meet my intention
kind of mindset. Yes, I was excited to be making some art, but there was also an element of,
I need to mark this off my to-do list.
But during the second week, as the initial excitement kind of began to wear off a little bit, I noticed that I was actually itching to create something most days. I genuinely wanted to make something. I wasn't just showing up because it was on the to-do list, but because I had the urge to be creative. Week 1 sparked the joy, but week 2 was building on it and really nurturing that love for creativity. As I was pulling out the weeds of comparing myself to other artists, believing that I shouldn't explore other subjects or mediums or styles, and believing that art was a chore rather than a passion, I started to find myself truly falling in love with the creative practice again. I was excited to show up for my creativity, not just my intention, if that makes sense. Just popping in with a word from our sponsor, me. If you're a fan of all things cozy, come check out my shop. From prints to stickers to keychains and magnets, there's literally something for every cozy creative. And if you're more of a curious creative, I also have a course on developing your own illustrations and a workbook on nurturing your own creative practice up in my shop as well. And as always, every order is Annie Jane approved. So without further ado, let's get back to creating. As the second week went on, I visited another familiar character, the little tomato girl. I will name her eventually, maybe, I don't know. She's been showing up in my art for several years now, and I still haven't gotten around to a name, so we'll see. Anywho, this brought me to another limiting belief. Limiting belief number 2, I shouldn't explore different mediums. So I'd started kind of tackling this one a little bit in week 1, and again with the bird skull piece, but it was definitely still present in my mind. Y'all know, I love gouache. It's my favorite medium. No other medium makes me feel the way I do when I paint with gouache. But I do love other mediums too. I love the way an ink drawing of a character looks different than a pencil sketch of the same character. I love the difference between the way a painting looks and the way a marker illustration looks. I love the difference in how you hold a pen versus how you hold a brush. I love exploring different mediums. And I needed to ask myself, have I been painting with gouache because I truly love to and that's what I want to do the most of, or because I believe I need to pick one medium and stick with it? Upon further investigation and some creative soul searching, I did realize that I truly do love painting with gouache, and I reach for it most because I love it most. But this challenge has helped me see that it's very important for me to also allow myself space and time to explore other mediums too. That exploration is a huge part of nurturing my own creativity. So I decided to begin exploring the tomato girl in a variety of different mediums, starting with multi-liner pens. I'd originally intended to turn it into a pen and marker illustration, but once I finished with the pen part, I realized I just wanted to keep it the way it was. My instincts were telling me that adding the marker was gonna make it lose the magic, so I decided to just trust my instinct. On that same day, I started the Fiona's Flavors illustration, which, if you watched that video, you know I was very, very nervous to start sketching. But because I trusted my creative instincts with the pen drawing, I felt a lot more confident going into the sketching process for that one and trusting my instincts with it. I could trust that I had good taste, that I knew when to stop and move on to the next part of the process, that I could come up with something that I genuinely liked. I think those little moments of trusting your creative intuition, they build on one another. They make you braver going into the next piece and braver in the piece after that. So for the next few days, I also explored colored pencils and graphite pencils for the tomato girl, and it was really interesting to see how she differed from medium to medium. When I draw her in pen, I tend to focus more on angles and line weight, but when I sketch her with pencils, she comes out a little bit softer and squishier, I guess. With pens, she feels a lot more active, and with pencils, she feels more cozy. Maybe that's just me projecting onto the character how I'm feeling when I use those specific mediums. I don't know. But that brings me to the other major limiting belief. Number 3, I should stick to one style. So for a long time, I've been really frustrated that I struggle to keep a consistent style. I feel like the style of the Meadow characters is relatively honed in now, but drawing people? Absolutely not. Very, very rarely do I draw the tomato girl the same way twice. But I think exploring her design with different mediums throughout this month really helped me start to overcome the mindset that she has to look the same every single time. Spoiler alert, when using different mediums between pieces, the outcomes are going to look different. Seems obvious to anyone with eyes, but I had a really hard time getting that point across in my own brain. The pen drawing will have a different effect than the painting, and that's okay. In some pieces, the tomato girl's nose might be a little farther up, or her hair a bit longer, or her proportions a bit pudgier. And I started to realize that maybe that's okay too. Maybe for me and my art, it's less about having a consistent design and more about the effect I want each specific piece to have. Because sometimes I want her to have that softer and cozier look, and other times I want her to look more angular and dynamic. Honestly, the style belief is still something I'm struggling with, but I think I am learning to let go of it slowly but surely. I did have a few more moments of frustration during this week compared to the first one. So for the colored pencil sketch, I struggled quite a bit with the pose, and with the graphite sketch, I struggled a lot with the eyes. But I think that was a good reminder that frustration and joy can be a part of the same practice. It's not always going to be one or the other. Sometimes it is, but more often than not, they're both present off and on throughout the process. And I'm learning that it's okay for them to coexist. So for the journal page on the day of the graphite sketch, I wrote, "Today was a reminder that the creative practice can be difficult. Your art won't always come out the way you want it to, and that's okay. But you have to keep coming back to the practice. You can't give up on your creativity when you're having a rough day. It's okay to let it go for the moment, but don't let it sit stagnant forever." Frustration is very common for artists. Sometimes you get a little too frustrated and overwhelmed, and you need to take a break for a moment, or even for the rest of the day. And I think that's where it's so crucial that we have grace on ourselves and remember that we're not perfect people, and we aren't perfect artists either. Sometimes the pose is tricky, or the anatomy is beyond our skill set. Sometimes the perspective just looks weird and you can't figure out why, and sometimes for no apparent reason, you're just struggling that day. But you show up again the next day because it's important to you. Because your creativity is worth it. Because maybe tomorrow you do make something you love. Maybe tomorrow you explore something and find that it's your new favorite thing. You keep showing up for your art, not just to it. But we'll talk more about that in one of the next videos. So one of the words that came up a lot in my week review journal pages for week 2 was filled. These simple moments of creativity were even more fulfilling for me than they were the first week. Even though I had a few sessions that were a little bit more frustrating, my creative practice as a whole was very, very fulfilling. Instead of each session depleting my creative energy, they were filling me up, and they gave me more to pour out in the next sessions. So one of my favorite questions in the weekly review pages is, how has your creative practice improved this week? So this was my answer for week 2. I feel less pressured to stick to a style. I'm simply having fun making things and not worrying about whether it's quote-unquote my thing or my medium. So as I began to let go of all these limiting beliefs and mindsets, I began to find a lot more joy in my art again. One of the things I'm learning is that my creativity has to come before my career. For years, I let outside influences or opinions, or even thoughts that I was projecting onto other people, I let those things snuff out why I made art in the first place. Joy. The joy of making. The joy of exploring. Playtime in my creative practice is very, very crucial for me. And I can't let the paycheck be more important than the playtime, if that makes sense. So by the end of week 2, I was definitely starting to see and feel the healing of my relationship with my creativity. But there was still a very, very long road ahead. I had 3 more weeks of this challenge left, and I was gonna start facing a lot of really big battles. During week 3 of this intention, it was time to tackle a different beast. Fear. I think we can all agree that fear is a very real thing in our creative practices. Fear that our skills aren't strong enough to create what's in our minds, or fear that no one else is gonna like it. Fear that we ourselves won't like it. Fear that we'll have wasted hours on something that amounted to nothing more than a colorful dumpster fire. Now, I'd like to say that during this week, I overcame all of my art fears, but that's not the truth. The truth is, I don't really think overcoming your art fears is really possible. To overcome means to defeat something, and I'm not sure we ever really defeat our art fears. But I do believe we can face them. And to face them, we need to understand them a little better. So let's look at what I believe are the 3 biggest and most common fears for artists. But first, what is fear? Fear is a feeling of anxiety rooted in uncertainty. And the very act of creativity is uncertain. You can do all the planning, all the sketching, all the color and value comps, all the practice studies, but you still cannot predict the outcome of your artwork. Maybe your dog bumps into you while you're painting and you run a streak of bright blue where there wasn't supposed to be one. Maybe you run out of ink before you finish your new pen drawing and discover that the ink you were using is now discontinued and there's not another exact match out there. Or maybe you follow all your planning to a T and the outcome just doesn't make you feel the way you thought it would. In the creative practice, anything can happen. It's an uncertain process. And all this uncertainty means that creativity requires courage. The courage to step out of our comfort zones, step into uncertainty, and make something anyway. The courage to face the possibility that we aren't good enough, that we're gonna mess up, or that we may not like what we end up with. So what are the 3 biggest creative fears? Number 1, the fear of imperfection. The fear that we are flawed and our art will be flawed. Spoiler alert, we are not perfect people, and therefore we are not perfect artists. And imperfect artists make imperfect art. There's always going to be something that we could have done better. A brushstroke we could have been looser with, a detail we could have added, a color that would have fit better than the one we used. I think a lot of people view perfectionism as a good thing. It means you're always striving to be better, always pushing yourself to the max, always doing your very best, right? But I honestly believe perfectionism is just another word for the fear of imperfection. And when your creativity is rooted in fear, I think that makes for a very unhappy artist. An artist that is so focused on the outcome of a piece that they forget to love the process that it takes to get them there. An artist that believes in method over magic, technical skill over emotional response. But I believe that true art is emotion. You can have the most technically good piece with absolutely no emotion behind it. I think that's part of what we're seeing now with AI art. Computer-generated imagery that is technically good, good values, good composition, good color palette, but it's void of any human emotion behind it. But we're straying off topic here. The point is that focusing too much on perfection, letting the fear of imperfection be the loudest voice in your head, that usually does one of 2 things. Either it stops you from making art in the first place, or it crushes the joy you have in your creative practice. And if you aren't really enjoying your creativity, then what's the point? So how do we face this fear? Well, first, I think it's important to acknowledge that wanting to do your best is not a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing. It means we care enough about our creativity that we want to put our effort into it. But we also need to acknowledge that our best will never be perfect. And sometimes our best isn't even that good. To face this fear, we need to embrace the messy. Embrace that the creative practice is itself a messy process, sometimes both literally and figuratively. The charcoal powder gets everywhere, the varnish stinks up the room, the eraser shavings from that hand you redrew 87 times are all over your desk now. Maybe the pen strokes and your hatch marks are a little uneven, you accidentally left your pinky fingerprint on the corner of your oil painting, or your gouache color comes out just a little bit muddy no matter how many times you try to mix it. Art is messy, and that's okay. We can quiet that fear of imperfection by embracing the mess. Embracing the reality that we are imperfect artists, but remembering that the art we make can still be beautiful even in that imperfection. In fact, I think sometimes the flaws can make our art even more beautiful. Yes, we can try our best, but we have to remember that our best doesn't mean perfect. Fear number 2, fear of failure. I think this one kind of goes hand in hand with the fear of imperfection, but they are a little bit different. Where fear of imperfection is more the fear of the little things that make your art imperfect, fear of failure is the fear that the whole thing is a waste. The fear that the mistakes in the piece will outweigh the good parts. The fear that you'll spend hours on a piece that your client doesn't like and refuses to pay for, or your art teacher holds up as the example of everything an artist could do wrong for the assignment. We tend to treat failure like it's the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen. But in a world where we're told that our productivity and the quality of our work are directly linked to our value as a human being, why wouldn't we? We need to acknowledge that failure is one of the potential outcomes every time we make something. But we also have to remember that our worth as a creative and as a person is not dependent on the quality of what we create. You're still an artist even if the last 8 pieces have been absolute failures. You're not a lesser person because you're lacking anatomy skills or color theory skills. And we can know all these things and believe all these things and still feel that fear of failure every time we show up to our creative practice. So to face that fear, we have to embrace the risk. The risk that we might mess up. We might not have what it takes to make what we have in mind. We might end up with a glorious dumpster fire of a failure. You face the fear, you embrace the risk, and you show up anyways because your creativity is worth it. I also want to mention that failure is a very, very necessary part of artistic growth. It's our most powerful teaching tool. When we fail, we learn what not to do. When we fail, we learn how to do better next time. Mileage is very important as artists, and failure makes up quite a bit of that mileage. So the time you spend on a failed piece is never wasted because you're learning, and learning itself is never a waste. The third fear, and I think the most uncomfortable and vulnerable one, is the fear that you won't like what you make. Art is so deeply personal. It's an outward expression of our inner thoughts and emotions. When we create, we put a little piece of ourselves into what we make. So when you don't like the end result, it just kind of feels like a betrayal. Like maybe we don't know ourselves as well as we thought we did, or maybe the piece shows us a new side of ourselves and we don't like what we see. Creativity is deeply personal, and when we don't like what we make, that pain is deep and personal too. And sometimes you can't even figure out what you don't like about what you made, and that in and of itself is very frustrating. So to face the fear of not liking what you make, you have to embrace every piece as part of your creative practice. Each piece, the good, the bad, the ugly, and the great, they all make up your creative practice. Those pieces have value beyond our emotional attachment to them. The pieces we don't like teach us what we do like. They teach us what our tastes are as artists. They also show us where we maybe do need to grow a little bit in our skills. And even the pieces we don't love, maybe they're still a blessing to someone else who sees it. Maybe you couldn't get the pose right and discover that you need to brush up on some figure drawing. Maybe you painted a bakery case and realized that food painting is not where you want to spend your time. Maybe you don't love the piece, but it's the new favorite of one of your fans on Instagram. These pieces we don't love are still members of our creative practice, and we need to embrace them as such, even though it's kind of uncomfortable. I do want to add a caveat here. Don't make something you don't like simply because someone else does. If you hate painting people, don't do portrait commissions just because they're popular on social media. If you don't love the way your ink drawings turn out, then don't start working exclusively with inks because the post you shared of one got the most likes you've ever gotten before. The art you make should be a reflection of your tastes, no one else's. So I noticed a common element among each of these fears, and I'm curious if you noticed it too. I had the briefest urge to reenact Dora the Explorer's
Can you guess what it is?
and then just stare soullessly into the camera. Anyways, I won't do that. I'll just tell you. Each of these fears puts more focus on the end result than on the process as a whole. These fears are all lies telling you that the end result is the most important part. But the truth is, creativity is about the process. It's about the experience of creating something. Yeah, it's great when you end up with a piece that you're really proud of and want to share with the world around you, but it's the joy in the act of creating that matters the most. If it was only the end result that drove us forward as artists, most of us would quit creativity almost immediately. Because we'd have this string of imperfect and failed pieces that we hate, and we'd say,
Well, what's the point? I'm not succeeding, I'm getting very overwhelmed, everything I make is trash, and I can't take it anymore.
But it's the love for the process that keeps us going. That keeps you creating even when you've had that string of failed pieces. When it gets frustrating and uncomfortable and the fear shouts its lies at you, the love of the process keeps you showing up. In one of the journal pages for this week, I wrote, "I persevered through fear today, and that will help me create more courageously tomorrow. The only way to get better is to keep trying and keep persevering through the fear." So when we keep coming back to the practice, when we keep showing up for it, we build creative courage. When overcoming our fears isn't an option, that courage helps us face it anyways. Because maybe creativity isn't about making something beautiful. It's about having the courage to show up at all and make something. So let's chat a little bit about the pieces for this week before we say our adieus. We started off with Stanley, the Marquee Meadow Milkman. Slow but steady, this little tortoise brings milk to every member of the meadow. Now, I don't remember the context at all, but someone mentioned a milkman at church, and I was like,
oh my gosh, the meadow doesn't have a milkman. We must remedy this as soon as possible.
I don't know, man, you really can find inspiration in the strangest places sometimes. So the process for this one was a little bit frustrating. I struggled a lot with the pose and definitely had some fear that I wasn't gonna like how this one turned out. I also struggled some with the values. Because this is a colored pencil sketch, it needed to have some pretty clear value separations to help communicate the form of the character and his props. Was I fully effective with this? Debatable. But like we talked about earlier, no piece is perfect. Overall, I do like how Stanley turned out.
I think he's pretty cute.
So the next piece was the ink and watercolor peach painting, and let me tell you, that was one of my favorite pieces of the entire challenge. I've had a lot of fear around watercolor and inks, mostly because I don't use them very often, but I struggle sometimes to make them work with one another. Like, I don't use gouache with inks because the gouache would just cover the ink drawings up anyways, but sometimes that also happens with watercolors. Like, the watercolors start to kill the lines of the ink, and I don't want that, but I don't know how to make it not happen. But this time it didn't. I don't know why, but it was a very seamless and very peaceful process, and I had such a great time painting these peaches. I had a lot of fun exploring different marks with my dip pen, exploring the blooming effects of the watercolors, and also the different ways that you can layer watercolors. Now you might be thinking,
Allie, we didn't see that part. What happened?
Apparently I accidentally deleted that piece of footage and it was irretrievable on both my phone and my computer. So I'm sorry. I already cried enough tears over it for the both of us, so let's just move on. Next up was the little tomato girl sitting on the floor in her socks. I'm not gonna lie, I wasn't really a fan of this piece. It's not bad, it's just not my favorite. The pose kind of turned out wonky, and that just happens sometimes. Honestly, I think that was one of the best lessons I learned during this whole intention. Because I was making so much art, the pieces I didn't really like didn't really bother me as much. I still had so many opportunities to make pieces I did love. And like we talked about earlier, each piece teaches us something, and we can still acknowledge the icky pieces as a valuable part of our creative practice. So on the next day, we got gouache again. I had a hankering to paint some more groceries, and that's what we did. I painted a little bag of groceries in this, scattering of groceries, I guess. What can I say? I love painting food. I definitely didn't go nearly as realistic with these ones. I kind of wanted to focus more on simplifying. I had a lot of fun with these. The day at the market vibes were very cozy for me. For this day's journal, I wrote about how content I felt while I was painting. You know, sometimes I really love to explore and try new things and be a little bit chaotic. But this creative session, although maybe not as exciting as all that, it was just very peaceful, very cozy. Just me and the paints and the palette having some cozy fun. So the last piece for this week was a little bit off the wall, a little random. At first, I showed up with absolutely no ideas, just crickets. But after a little bit, I decided I wanted to explore a little bit of anatomy. And one of my favorite ways to do that is by sketching different yoga poses. It was quite slow going at first. I was kind of afraid I wasn't going to be able to fit the whole pose on the page, so there was quite a bit of erasing. but I actually ended up really, really loving the final sketch. I had a lot of fun and a little bit of frustration exploring how skin and fat folds over on itself depending on how the body is twisting and turning. So for example, when the femur is perpendicular to the torso, there's always going to be a very significant crease and a little bit of fat folding where the femur inserts into the hip joint. Or when the back is arched, usually at least a little bit of skin is going to fold over on itself. I don't know, I just think it's so interesting how the body changes and contorts in different poses. So during the weekly review journal pages for week 3, I asked myself, how has your creative practice improved this week? And here was my answer. I'm just having more fun and not feeling like it's a chore to meet my intention. It's becoming a fun habit. The more I faced my fears, the less pressure I felt going into each new piece. That creative courage was really building on itself, and I was just getting excited to show up every day. But we still had 2 weeks left, and I was going to be facing another big battle in the next one. Flow. The gift of the creative. That special state in the creative process where you kind of just get lost in what you're making. Time ceases to exist, the world around you goes quiet, and you're completely in the zone. Smoke alarms could be going off, or a herd of unicorns could come crashing through your studio, and you'd be none the wiser. But all of a sudden, you can't figure out the pose you're sketching, or the colors in your painting are just a little bit off. Or that line of ink that was supposed to be straight is now curvy because you had to sneeze. And in comes frustration. The curse of the creative. And then the flow state breaks. As you struggle with the piece, you get more and more frustrated and ultimately end up rage quitting. We all face frustration in our creative practice. It's the enemy of flow, right? But what if I told you it doesn't have to be that way? That it's possible to face frustration and maintain the flow, to channel that frustration into something else. So at the beginning of July, I decided to embark on a 30-day quest to heal my relationship with my creativity. I wanted to nurture the precious garden that is creativity. During this week of art, week 4, I really started to see the growth and beauty in my little garden. But frustration was still a weed I hadn't plucked out yet. Now, what exactly is a weed? To answer this, I went to the source of all knowledge.
Wikipedia.
Anywho. So the Wikipedia definition says, a weed is a plant considered undesirable in a particular situation, growing where it conflicts with human preferences, needs, or goals. So in the cases of negative mindsets and creative fears, those were definitely weeds. They were constantly impeding my growth as an artist and choking out my love for creativity. But in the case of frustration, it wasn't exactly the same. As the definition says, yes, it does conflict with my human preference for life to be easy and fun all the time. I would definitely prefer not to feel frustrated when I'm creating, but during those events of frustration, I usually learned some pretty good lessons. Not only that, but when I persevered through the frustration, my discipline as an artist also grew. The emotion of frustration was a bit of a weed, but the events that brought out that emotion were not. They were actually very beneficial. So frustration comes during one of two events. Number one, it comes when we can't figure something out, like maybe the perspective is off somehow, or you can't seem to mix the right color. And number two, it comes when you've made a mistake, like a brushstroke that wasn't supposed to be there, or an ink droplet that splatters on your character's face. In both of these cases, we've entered into a puzzle, a challenge. In the first case, we have to figure out what isn't working. And in the second case, we have to fix the mistake we've made. Figure or fix, those are the options. We've entered into this boss battle of creative problem solving. Now, I love puzzles. Jigsaw puzzles, logic puzzles, video games, those are puzzles too. Puzzles are challenging, they're thought-provoking, and at times, they're frustrating. But why am I so much more willing to face frustration in a jigsaw puzzle than in my creative practice? Truthfully, I don't really have a solid answer to that question, but I do have a theory. So creativity is personal. It's an extension of ourselves. In a jigsaw puzzle or a video game, it's not a part of us. However much we immerse ourselves into the puzzle or the story of the game, it's still an external challenge that we're simply participating in. But because creativity is such a personal practice, when we're struggling with a puzzle in our art, we feel it personally. That frustration is much, much deeper. And it's a lot harder to face because it's a much more internal struggle. But just like with a jigsaw puzzle or a video game boss battle, that challenge and frustration is worth it because it leads to a reward. You complete the jigsaw puzzle and see the full pretty picture. Or you defeat the boss and gain a new superpower or magical tool and move on to the next level. And I believe the same is true when we face frustration in our creative practice. If we can persevere through it, we gain a new creative skill or level up our artistic discipline. Now you might be thinking,
Wow, that's very motivational, Allie, but how do you actually deal with frustration?
I get it. It's a lot easier to say all of this than it is to actually do it. Step number 1. When frustration comes up in our creative practice, at the risk of sounding like a hippie, we need to take a deep breath and remember that in the creative practice, everything is figure-outable or fixable. You can do this.
You're freaking Bob the Builder. You can fix it. Yes, you can.
Oftentimes it's in that first feeling of frustration that we quit. It starts to get a little bit uncomfortable and we just give up. We start to feel like we're not good enough, or our skills aren't strong enough, or we're just not smart enough to fix the problem. But simply taking a breath and remembering that it's really not that deep can get you over that initial resistance and help you persevere. Step number 2, we need to reframe our mindset. So instead of looking at the problem like it's some immense, deeply personal shortcoming, look at it like you're a creative detective and this is simply a creative puzzle to solve. Start to find the fun in the challenge. Because the reality is, deep down, we really do like hard things. That's why we seek out challenges like puzzles and video games and board games. We enjoy strategizing and figuring things out. The hard makes the reward that much sweeter. Imagine how much you're going to grow in your art skills and your artistic discipline when you do figure out the problem. All of a sudden, you understand perspective in a whole new way, or you turn the ink splotch you spilled on your character into a really super cool tattoo. You come out on the other side of the challenge a better artist. Now you might be wondering,
just think differently? That's the advice? Yeah, let me just take 2 seconds to rewire my entire brain real quick.
I know it's a lot easier to say than it is to do. It takes a lot of practice to let go of frustration and embrace the hard things. But you take it one step, one piece at a time, little by little growing your creative endurance. That's why we keep showing up for our creativity. That's why we embrace the struggle and push through it. Because the more you do it, the less frustrated you become over time. Or maybe not necessarily less frustrated, maybe more that our endurance gets stronger and we're able to, for lack of a better term,
suck it up.
So during this week of art, I faced many moments of struggle. The whale painting in particular did not at all go as I had planned it to. But I realized something this week. Even in those struggle moments, the frustration didn't really overwhelm me. I acknowledged that feeling and shifted my mindset. I started not only to embrace the challenges, but to enjoy them. Instead of them breaking my flow state, the challenges simply became a part of it. Because I'd spent the last 3 weeks making art every single day, my endurance was building up and I could embrace that detective mindset instead of feeling absolutely hopeless when I inevitably met a challenge. Do I still get frustrated? Yes, unfortunately, I am human. But every piece that I face frustration with and push through builds my endurance and makes it a little bit easier to push through the next time. But sometimes the frustration does get too overwhelming. And in that case, we move on to step 3. Step number 3, step away and take a break. Maybe you didn't sleep well last night and your energy is down. Maybe work was rough today and you don't have a lot of brain space for creative problem solving. Or maybe for no apparent reason, you just cannot seem to figure this problem out. Whatever the reason, whether it's external or internal, sometimes the frustration just builds up. And the more frustrated we become, the more frazzled our headspace becomes. We're no longer thinking clearly, we're not going to make good choices, and we need a little bit of alone time away from our art. So when this happens for me, I love to go for a walk. I mean, I love going for walks anytime because I just like being outside, but especially when I'm feeling frustrated and frazzled, going for a walk is almost always guaranteed to help me let go of the frustration. And something pretty cool happens when we step away from a problem for a bit. Our brain subconsciously is still kind of working on it, just without our chaotic and frustrated input. Oftentimes, midway through a frustration walk, the answer just pops into my head. Like,
oh, the shadow needs to shift the other direction there. No wonder it looks wrong.
Or,
I can hide that fingerprint paint smudge by painting this super cool prop over the top of it.
Or the other week when I was really struggling with the thumbnail sketches for a new Marquee Meadow painting. I was just sitting and eating some dinner, minding my own business, when all of a sudden 3 ideas popped into my head that would completely mend the compositional problems I was facing. A walk, a nap, a snack. These simple breaks can make a world of difference. And sometimes no grand ideas magically appear, but the break has given me the opportunity to clear my head and come back to the piece with a fresh set of eyes that are much more ready to see the solution, and an attitude that is much more willing to push through to solve the problem. Like the fears we talked about in last week's video, frustration is a common part of the creative practice. It's not something we ever fully overcome. It's like a dandelion, it just keeps coming back. But we can face it and persevere through it. We have to remember that facing difficulties in our art is not a bad thing. The challenges can be a part of our flow state too. They don't have to compete with one another. We simply have to adjust our mindset toward it, to see it in a new light. If I may use another garden metaphor here, to see the beauty in the dandelion, not just view it as a weed we need to pluck out. So let's chat a little bit about the pieces for this week before we say our goodbyes. First up was the bear and butterfly sketch. Genuinely, this is one of my absolute favorite colored pencil sketches from this challenge. Now, I struggled quite a bit with figuring out the pose for the little bear, but I didn't really face any frustration with that. I was more just curious about how I could make the pose work out. I ended up really enjoying the challenge, and it was a really great reminder that frustration doesn't have to be my immediate response to facing hard things. I can instead embrace curiosity and find the fun in the challenge. Next up was the ink and watercolor whale illustration, which had a very interesting outcome. Not the outcome of the painting itself, that part is mediocre at best in my opinion, but my attitude toward it was very interesting. First of all, whale anatomy, not familiar with that at all. Also, it was very challenging because I was exploring some different watercolor techniques and some of them were not going very well, but I really loved the process even though I didn't really love the end result. I enjoyed the challenge and the exploration, and that was enough for me. It didn't really matter how the piece turned out because I enjoyed the simple act of creating. Day 3 was the gouache bird and blueberries painting, which was such a joy to make. I'd really had a hankering to paint a bird and finally decided to just do it. I don't think this is an actual bird. I just kind of painted with the colors I wanted to use and pulled from the little bit of bird anatomy that I know. But I think that kind of rusty orange color plays really well with the blueberries. Also, I had a lot of fun with that golden rim lighting. I mean, yellow, What more can I say? This was definitely one of those pieces that I felt excited to do because I'd tackled a lot of my limiting beliefs earlier on in the challenge. Now, day 4 was different. We had lost a friend very suddenly, and honestly, I was just a bit numb that day. I still showed up to create my art piece for the day because I knew it was going to be good for me. I decided to do an easy little alcohol marker sketch of the little tomato girl. She's a very familiar subject that I didn't really have to put a lot of thought into, and alcohol markers are a pretty quick medium with an easy cleanup.
No palettes or dip pens to clean this time.
To be honest, my heart wasn't really in this piece. When dealing with loss or grief, I tend to shut off emotionally for the first little bit, so I just didn't really have anything to give to this piece. But that's the thing about creativity. It's a give and take relationship. And even though I didn't have anything to give it this day, it gave me something. It helped me simply relax for a little bit of time and not really think about anything. I could just get lost in the process and find a bit of peace in it. So the next day, I was feeling a little bit more excited about art and decided to paint these two little dual illustrations of Bits and Bobbles having a day at the beach. Now, I definitely faced some frustration with the Bobbles painting. I used a sample scrap of watercolor paper and pretty much hated it. It just did not play well with the gouache for some reason. But I was determined to finish the piece anyways. I definitely had a lot more fun painting the one of Bits though. I also think it turned out a little bit better because the paper wasn't doing whatever it was doing. I don't know. This was a watercolor paper I've used before and really like, so it was definitely much more enjoyable. And the last piece was the ink illustration of the little tomato girl. Honestly, I just really wanted to get out my dip pen again. It is definitely a tool I've been reaching for a lot more often lately. But instead of my typical ink and watercolor combo, I decided to just stick with the inks this day. Because it's monochromatic, I had to do a little bit more problem solving with the values, figuring out how to create a clearer illustration. I also explored a bit of line art with a brush this time. I am always enthralled when I see other artists do line art with a brush, and I wanted to give it a try too. I definitely need a lot of practice, but it was really fun to explore. Creative discipline. It's a very uncomfy topic with a lot of very hot takes. There's a lot of opinions out there in the art world on whether you should or shouldn't make art every day, whether or not you're truly committed to your art if you don't, whether or not creative discipline encourages burnout. So today, I'm gonna add my own opinion to the mix. Since becoming a full-time artist, I've struggled a lot with balancing my creativity with my career. Without realizing it was happening, I lost the love for my art over time, and passion turned to pressure. What should have been a joyful and creative career turned into more of a paint-covered nightmare. So in the final week, week 5, we're tackling one more element, creative discipline. My mindset on what discipline is and how it should look in my own creative practice changed a lot during this month. So if you've seen some of my other videos, you've probably heard me say that you don't have to draw every day to be a creative. And I still believe that's true. My mindset on that has not changed. I don't think creativity should simply be something you check off the list every day, and your status as an artist should not be dependent on the number of pieces you create every year. So when I was younger, I drew pretty much every day. Like the minute I finished school, I had my sketchbook and pencils out, ready to explore whatever my imagination came up with. I took my sketchbook to church, to doctor's appointments, to the dentist, to the grocery store. I was basically never without pencil and paper. I loved creating. I needed to create. There was so much creative energy and so many ideas that needed this outlet. So when I was around 16, I think, is that right? It sounds right. I don't know. 15, 16, 17.
Somewhere in there.
I decided I wanted to pursue art as a career. I was getting a lot of commissions, and art was actually seeming like a viable option. I also started having some more serious health issues, and college was looking less and less like a good idea for me after high school. So with the help of very encouraging and very supportive parents, we made it official. I had an actual art business. That first year or so felt pretty good. I was excited, and I was making a lot of art that I really enjoyed. I was still making art pretty much every day. But over time, those limiting beliefs that we talked about in week 2 kind of started to creep in. Beliefs like,
I have to find my style and stick to a niche, which means I probably shouldn't explore this subject or use this medium because it doesn't really fit the vibes of these other pieces I've made.
I also accepted every single commission under the sun that came my way, whether the idea excited me or not, because I thought that that's just what you do when you're building an art business. I think people just assume that if you're an artist, you like making anything and you're going to be good at anything. And I'm here to tell you that is not the case. I would take on projects I had no business doing. There were several client combats where I'd start a piece and they'd want adjustments that simply were not possible, or they'd request changes that, honestly, I just hated. There's a certain amount of creative liberty that gets taken away with commissions or freelancing, and honestly, I didn't like that. Lesson learned. But anywho, we're getting off topic at this point. Because I was starting to box myself in creatively and taking on projects that I wasn't really passionate about, art began to feel like more of a chore than something I loved doing. At this point, I was still making art every day, but I wasn't really enjoying it. But I felt like I had to because
I'm an artist, and that's what you do.
I wanted to have creative discipline, which meant making art every day, right? Even though I was kind of starting to hate it a little bit. I do want to add a caveat here. It's not that I always hated making art. There were still plenty of moments that I did enjoy what I was making and the act of creativity, but overall, it was starting to feel like more of a job and less of a passion. Creative discipline became this almost shame cycle, like if I didn't make art every day, I was a bad artist or I wasn't committed to my career. Even though this mindset was just making the problem worse and making me even more bitter toward my art. But I ignored the warning bells going off in my head and just kept pushing. I'd watch every video I could about growing your art business, and they were all saying,
Go, go, go! Push, push, push! Make art every day! Find your niche! Make the monies however you can!
And me, being a very impressionable and gullible kid, was like,
well, I no longer love this, but okay, you're the expert.
So instead of keeping my creativity at the forefront, I simply focused on the career side. And I did this under the guise of work-life balance. Apparently, I thought that that would help me feel a little bit better. Spoiler alert, it did not. Balance was not really the issue, my relationship with creativity was. So fast forward a few years, and I'm sure you can guess this all led to some pretty intense burnout. I'm not gonna lie, most days, I hated art. I created only when I had to. I no longer sketched during movie night because I was off the clock. I didn't bring my sketchbook with me anywhere because I just wanted a break from it. But all these art videos were still saying,
make art every day! Make art every day! You gotta have creative discipline.
But what do you do when you don't love it anymore? Does that creative discipline still apply when you've begun to hate the creative side of yourself? Do you just keep pushing and ignore the burnout? Or is making art every day simply going to make the problem worse? So this was a very real fear of mine when I started my 30-day challenge to make a piece of art every day. Burnout was what had struck the enmity between me and my creativity in the first place, so was committing to making art every day just going to deepen the problem? So I took all of the limitations off the table. I was gonna allow myself to use any medium, draw any subject, for any length of time, just to see if I could spark a little ember of joy in my creative practice. It was quite literally a last-ditch effort. And to my great excitement, that first week did spark joy. I started to just make things for fun, no need to show them to anyone or make products from them. I could just explore and make art for the joy of it. Yes, part of it was still for the purpose of meeting my intention and checking it off the list, but as I let go of my limiting beliefs and faced a lot of creative fears and frustrations, I truly was healing my relationship with my creativity. And somewhere along the way, my mindset shifted from showing up to my creative practice to showing up for my creative practice. And that one little switch made all the difference. As I began to love my creativity again, I wanted to show up for it. It wasn't just something to mark off my list anymore. It was a necessary part of my life. It was a gift that I found joy in. I looked at it like the relationship it was that requires nurturing and showing up when it's difficult. Because the truth is, sometimes you don't feel like showing up. Maybe you didn't sleep well last night, or the kids have a concert this evening, or a friend shows up on your doorstep just needing to talk. We touched on this a little bit in last week's video. So on one of the days, we'd lost a family friend, and I just didn't have it in me. I didn't feel like creating. I was pretty numb emotionally, and I just didn't feel like showing up. But I showed up for my creativity anyways, because internally, I knew it was gonna be good for me. Not just for my skills and my imagination, but honestly, for my heart. So when you show up to your creative practice, you're showing up because you think you should. But when you show up for your creative practice, you're showing up because you know it's good for you. Instead of looking at it from a place of shame, like,
well, I'm a bad artist if I don't make art every day.
Or,
I'm an artist, art should always be fun, so maybe I'm not a real artist if I don't feel like making something.
Instead, I started to look at it as, even though I don't feel like it, I know it's good for me. Even though I don't have much to give creativity today, this is an opportunity for creativity to give me something. On those days, creativity gave me a space of peace, a place to relax and just unwind a little bit. Whether or not I made something cool wasn't the point. The simple act of creating just made me feel better. But it didn't make me feel better when I was showing up to it because I thought I should. There are always going to be ebbs and flows to the creative practice. Some days you're feeling all the motivation, all the inspiration, and you're literally itching to make something. And other days, you just don't have anything to give. But creative discipline means showing up for your art because you know it's good, not because you should. So do I think we should make art every day? Truly, I do not believe there's a one-size-fits-all answer to this. When I was treating art like a chore, it wasn't good for me to be making art every day. It was just digging the grave a little bit deeper because I was already bitter toward my creativity. I needed time away from it. But since my mindset has shifted, since I've healed the relationship and I'm embracing my creativity again, it is good for me to be making art every day. It keeps my skills fresh, it keeps my imagination fresh, it keeps the excitement alive. Since this challenge, I have continued making something every day. Sometimes it's working on a new painting, sometimes it's a 10-minute sketch in my messy sketchbook. Do I feel like making art every day? No, not always. But I show up for my creativity anyways because I believe it's good for me. And since healing my relationship with it, I always walk away from those creative sessions grateful for that creative time. There was a point when I was extremely burnt out and that was not the case. Like I said, those creative sessions just made me feel worse. And if that's how you're feeling, maybe making art every day isn't the right thing for you either. Maybe you need to work on healing your relationship with your creativity. Or maybe you do have a good relationship with it, but you literally cannot create something every day. Maybe for you, creative discipline looks like showing up every Saturday morning at the coffee shop to sketch. Or maybe you carve out an hour or two every other evening after the kids go to bed. You find the time to show up for your creativity because you love it and you know it's good for you, not simply cranking out a piece every day because you think you should. So let's chat a little bit about these pieces and where my own creative discipline grew this week. First up was the little cookie pen sketch scattering page. I don't even know what to call this. Let's start with one of the journal questions for this one. The question was, why did you make what you made today? Genuine excitement to create, or simply wanting to meet your intention? My answer was, truthfully, mostly to meet my intention. I'm pretty tired this morning, and I just didn't really feel like making anything. But I'm so glad I showed up for my creativity anyways. So I love this question. It makes me be honest with myself, but also doesn't shame me for my honest answers. It's not a,
there's one right answer here.
It's simply, what was your purpose in this? I originally was going to paint the cookies in gouache, but then I just decided to keep it simple with some pens. No muss, no fuss, no palettes to clean afterwards. Just some line practice, sketching some cookies. So one of the things we talk about in the Nurture workbook is the concept of active rest. It's a technique used in the fitness world to keep your momentum going, to restore your body's energy levels, to give your muscles time to recover and regrow, and to avoid burnout. On the day or two after an intense workout like a big run or a weightlifting session, you still move your body. Maybe you take a couple of walks or do a stretchy yoga flow or work on a little bit of mobility. The point isn't to push yourself to the max on those days, but to allow your body to rest and recover while still keeping the flow going. You may not feel like moving, but you do it because it's good for you. So this was an active rest day of creativity for me. I did something a little easier, a little quicker, still keeping those creative muscles in shape, but also honoring the fact that I was tired and just didn't really have a lot of creative energy. On the next day, though, I was in high creative gear. My answer to the earlier question on this day was mostly just wanting to create. I really wanted to get out my gouache paints. And I was having an absolute blast painting. Totally in the zone, could have been there for hours, but life things happen sometimes, and external events can pull you away from your practice or make it more difficult. I found out that the car I'd been interested in was ready to be looked at, and this was the day to do it. So I set my paints aside and headed out the door to go look at it, get it inspected, all the things. It was a huge blessing, and I was super excited, but it took most of the day. So when I got home that evening, even though I only had like 10% of the painting left to finish, I just didn't really feel like it. The artsy mojo was kind of gone. I was tired, I was done, I was hungry, it was almost supper time. But it's not about just showing up when you feel like it or when it's easy. Like any other relationship, sometimes it means showing up when you're weary and you don't feel like it. And that's creative discipline. And because throughout this challenge I'd been building up that discipline, I was able to sit down and finish the painting without having any bitterness toward it. I talked to my sister and my niece over FaceTime while I finished it and ended up really loving the painting. Was it my ideal way of finishing something? No. I would have preferred to paint it all at once when I was already in the zone. Instead, I was honestly a bit frazzled coming back to it because I'd had a long day and I couldn't remember what color I'd mixed over there or what part I wanted to paint next. But this moment of choosing discipline over ease grew me in my creative practice, and I'm very grateful for it. I do want to throw in a little piece of advice for creatives who are actively pursuing an art career or have considered pursuing one. There's a saying out there that if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. And those words can be so damaging to a professional. They can make you feel like you must not really love what you're doing because some days it does feel like work. Some days it's hard and uncomfortable and you don't feel like showing up. So please know you are not alone in those feelings. They are totally normal and they're simply a part of the ebb and flow of creativity. It's okay that it's hard to show up sometimes. You're still an artist and you still love your art. So the final day was very bittersweet for me. It was absolutely thrilling to know that I'd completed my challenge, but also really sad to see it come to an end. So I wanted to make a piece that embodied what I'd learned and how I'd grown throughout the month. I decided to paint this little pair of boots with marigolds coming out of them. I used a medium other than gouache because I was no longer held back by the belief that I should stick to a medium. I painted a concept that I've seen other artists do too, but I wanted to put my own spin on it. I used colors that I love, and I focused on finding the joy in my creativity. I think the little boots are a really good representation of how far I've come in healing my relationship with my creativity and how much growth has come out of this challenge. And at the risk of sounding cheesy, it's also kind of a symbol that the journey isn't over. My creative practice will continue on as long as I'm alive. I'll keep learning and growing and failing and getting frustrated and solving puzzles and pushing ahead when it's hard. We're going to tour through all the artwork throughout this journey, including the pieces I didn't film the process of. We'll recap everything I learned, see whether I really achieved my intention or not, and talk about what my creativity looks like going forward. So strap your seatbelts on,
Safety first.
and let's take a drive down memory lane. Week 1 was all about sparking joy in my creative practice again. We started the week off with an ink and watercolor illustration of this little fox and butterfly. I've always really loved using my dip pen, but I honestly couldn't even remember the last time I'd gotten it out. I thought maybe switching things up with a different medium might spark a little bit of joy, and it definitely did. It was a great first piece to help me loosen up a little bit and simply try to have fun. That first week I used several different mediums, partially for the joy of it and partially for the convenience of some of them. We were visiting my sister over the weekend, and I just needed something a little less messy than gouache, so I brought along some multi-liners and some alcohol markers. It had also been a while since I'd gotten out my markers, so I think part of my joy this week was simply revisiting some old friends, I guess you could say. I actually used to be quite the marker enthusiast a few years ago, so it was definitely fun to explore the medium again. In week 2, we started to really get into more of the nitty-gritty head and heart work. I tackled 3 big limiting beliefs that had been crippling my creative practice for a very long time without me realizing it. Number 1, I shouldn't explore different subjects in my art. Number 2, I shouldn't explore different mediums. And number 3, I should stick to one style. So I took some risks this week and made some more experimental art. This was the week I made one of my favorite pieces from the challenge, the little forager girl wearing a bird skull. That piece really broke all 3 of those limiting beliefs for me. It's not a subject I've done before, skeletal art isn't really a go-to for me. I used ink and watercolor, which is not the gouache medium most people tend to associate with my artwork. And it's not exactly a cozy style or theme, but I loved it. I had such an amazing time creating it, and I honestly didn't really care if anyone else would like it or not. I stopped focusing on the impact each piece would have on my career and focused instead on the impact they'd have on my creativity. I painted some veggie groceries just because I wanted to. I explored the little tomato girl in different mediums just because I wanted to. I explored different proportions and styles for the little tomato girl, you guessed it, just because I wanted to. But while we did a lot of really deep work in my mindset toward creativity in week 2, there were definitely more beasts to battle in week 3. So week 3 was a combat with fear. Fear is a very real thing in our creative practices, and while I don't believe we can fully overcome fear, I do believe we can face it. Sort of quiet its voice, I guess you could say. So what were my 3 biggest art fears? Number 1, fear of imperfection. The fear of all the little mistakes in my work that remind me that I'm not a perfect person. The truth is, there's always going to be things I could have done better in my art. Brushstrokes that could be smoother, shapes that could be clearer, colors more vibrant, and compositions more appealing. But when we focus on achieving perfection, we're placing more importance on the end result rather than the process it takes to get there. The joy we can have in simply creating. So to face my fear of imperfection, I had to embrace the messy, embrace the imperfect parts of my practice, and learn to just love the process. The art I make can still be beautiful and impactful without being perfect. Fear number 2, the fear of failure. I think our society as a whole is very uncomfortable with failure. We view it as something shameful. We view failures as a waste of time. We view failure as some deeply personal shortcoming. But failure doesn't have to be negative. It's an incredible teaching tool in our practice. It shows us what not to do. It shows us how to do better next time. And it shows us our own tastes as artists. So to face my fear of failure, I had to embrace the risk. To embrace that failure is always a possible outcome, but to remember that sometimes failure is the only way to learn. A failed piece isn't wasteful, it's creative mileage that still moves me forward in my practice. And the third fear I had to face was the fear that I wouldn't like what I made. When we don't like something we make, it just hurts. It feels like you don't like you because art is personal. We put little pieces of ourselves into everything we make. So to face that fear, I had to embrace every single piece as a part of my creative journey. The ones I loved and the ones I didn't. The ones I framed for my wall and the ones I wanted to rip up and cast into Mount Doom. Because creativity isn't about always loving the end result. It's about showing up and making something and finding joy in the process. Each of these fears put more focus on the end result than on the process as a whole. So as I began to face these fears and work through them, I began to love the entire creative process more and more. So week 4 brought me into a battle between frustration and flow. Frustration, like fear, is another common element in our creative practice. It comes when we either can't figure something out or we've made a mistake. I think our first instinct when we face frustration is to rage quit. Frustration is annoying and it's uncomfortable. But this week taught me that frustration doesn't have to break my flow state. I can shift that frustration and channel it into a more beneficial mindset. So I learned to reframe my mindset and look at the problems in my art as creative puzzles for me to solve. I learned to find the fun in the challenge. Unfortunately, this isn't just a switch you can flip in your brain that makes it instantly easier to solve every problem and deal with your frustration. The hard is still hard. But each time you deal with frustration and push through it, you come out on the other side with more artistic endurance. But sometimes the frustration is big and I just need to take a break from a piece. And that's absolutely okay too. Sometimes a walk or a snack just gives me enough time to clear my head, adjust my attitude, and come back to the piece with a fresh pair of eyes. I'm human. I still get frustrated, but this week taught me that everything in art is figure-outable or fixable, and I just need to give myself the time and the headspace to do it. So in week 5, we tackled one last piece of my creative practice, creative discipline. More specifically, the question of whether or not you should make art every day. For years, I'd heard professional artists saying,
"You have to make art every day. You need to make art every day."
And while I truly do think they had the best intentions in what they were saying, it's a very vague and broad generalization that doesn't necessarily apply to every artist. It's a statement that can make you feel like you aren't an artist if you don't make art every day, or that your value as an artist is tied up in the number of pieces you make in a year. Like the art fears, those words can put more emphasis on just putting out a piece rather than enjoying the creative process. So even though I was dealing with extreme burnout with my creativity, I thought I just had to keep cranking out pieces because I thought that's what creative discipline meant. Looking back, I know that's just made the problem worse. Hindsight's 2020. But as I began to heal my relationship with my creativity and learn to love the practice again, making art every day was good for me. And that's when my intention shifted from nurturing a willingness to show up to my creative practice to showing up for my creative practice. The word "to" felt more like showing up because I thought I should, and I would shame myself if I didn't show up. But the word "for" felt more like showing up because I knew it was good for me, because I loved art even if I didn't always feel like making something. There are ebbs and flows to the creative practice. Some days you're full of motivation, and other days you just don't really feel like showing up. But you show up for your art anyways because it's good for you. But I don't think creative discipline means you have to show up every single day. I think it's more about long-term consistency. I think it means different things for different artists. For the creative who isn't in a good place with their creativity, maybe creative discipline looks like acknowledging that you don't like where you are and working on healing your relationship with creativity. For the stay-at-home mom homeschooling her kids, maybe creative discipline looks like taking an hour every other evening after the kids go to bed and just spending some time making art. Or maybe you're in a good place with your art and creative discipline looks like sitting down for 5 minutes to doodle even though you don't exactly feel like it. On those days, the days I might not have anything to give to creativity, the creativity still gives me something. Whether it gives me a few moments of rest from a busy day or a smile from doodling a simple bits and bobbles sketch. Because my relationship with my creativity is healed, I always walk away from a creative session feeling good. So did I achieve what I set out to do? Did I heal my relationship with creativity? Did I meet my intention? I would definitely say yes. Is my creative practice perfect? No. Do limiting beliefs and fears and frustrations still creep in sometimes? Absolutely. But this challenge has really equipped me to face all of those things. It's helped me let go of the limiting beliefs and explore in my art practice. It's helped me learn how to face my fears, to deal with my frustrations, and it's built up my creative discipline and endurance. And most of all, it's helped me find joy in my creativity again. I learned that not only is it okay for me to explore in my practice, but that it's actually crucial for me to explore. I'm a creative that thrives on curiosity and exploration. I love to learn and try new things and play with different mediums. Some creatives find their joy in one subject or one medium, and that's awesome, but that's not me. And this challenge taught me that that is okay. My creative practice doesn't have to look like anyone else's. I learned that creativity isn't about always making something you love 110%. It's not even about making something amazing. Sometimes it's simply about showing up to make something. Not out of guilt or shame, but out of love for the act of creativity. So how will my creative practice change and grow moving forward? I believe I will be more intentional about the frequency of my creativity, still trying to create something every day, even if it's just a simple doodle. Because I'm finding joy in my creativity again and loving the process, it's not a burden anymore to bring my sketchbook with me when I go out. Art isn't something I'm hiding from anymore. It's something I'm actively seeking. Yes, there is still resistance sometimes. Like we talked about for week 5, you don't always feel like making art. But I'm still trying to show up daily for my creativity because I know it's good for me. It keeps my skills strong, it gives me space to explore, it helps me expand my imagination, and it releases creative energy. And sometimes when I'm just having a rough day, it gives me a moment of peace and coziness. If you've been part of my little YouTube community for a while now, you've probably seen me do some pretty intense challenges over the years. Challenges like painting 100 scene studies or developing 20 original illustrations for my portfolio. And these kinds of challenges most definitely grew me as an artist. The 100 Scene Studies challenge grew my compositional, color mixing, and painting skills by leaps and bounds. The 20 Illustrations challenge helped me dive deeper into my own creative style and grew my storytelling skills. But this challenge, these simple 30 days of consistent creativity and delving into my thought patterns, this grew me more than all the other challenges combined, I think. Because this is what restored my relationship with my creativity. It restored the love for it. And if you don't love your creativity, then all the skills in the world don't really matter. So how do I feel about my creative practice now versus at the beginning of the challenge? I can honestly say I feel much more confident and playful. Confident that I'm capable of learning and growing, and playful in my exploration of different mediums and subjects. I used to be so focused on finding a style, but I'm realizing that God has given me the incredible gift of loving exploration, loving many different subjects and styles and mediums. It's time for me to stop rejecting that gift and glorify my creator by using it to the fullest. I really don't want this video to sound like I'm the one that made it all happen. Yes, I did do a lot of hard work, but I genuinely believe it is all thanks to God that I made it through this challenge. I prayed a lot about all of this, prayers for strength in the hard moments, and prayers of gratefulness for each bit of growth. This challenge was so beneficial for me, and I'm so excited to keep moving forward. Anywho, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed seeing all of the artwork and going on this 30-day journey with me. If any of the pieces struck your eye, I do have some of the originals available as well as prints up in my shop. And huge thank you to the Cozy and Curious Creatives over on Patreon for helping to support my art journey. I genuinely could not do this without you guys. If you're interested in learning how you can spice up your own creative practice, then head on over to watch this video next. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye guys!